Greetings and welcome to another lecture on the personality disorders. What we're going to start out with now is one of the more common ones. In fact, you may have actually heard of this one. I don't know if it's more common, but it is kind of more well known. And that is borderline personality disorder. Now, borderline personality disorder is so named because they originally thought that this disorder was on the borderline of neuroses and psychoses. If you remember back in class, these many years it seems like ago, I talked about how neurosis was the name for things that were relatively mild, and psychosis were the name for things that were relatively severe. And so borderline was considered to be sort of on the borderline between those two things. What's going on here are problems and changes with interpersonal relationships, mostly. And that's mostly what you see it with. Again, there's the impulsivity and instability that you may see in some of the other personality disorders. But this is not only in interpersonal relationships, it's also in person's self-image and in their moods. They would score high on neuroticism, shall we say, if we're doing the big five personality theories. So affect is a fancy word for emotion. So there's affective instability, which basically means that their emotions are all over the map. They often have feelings of emptiness, and they very often feel that they cannot be alone. Being alone is the worst thing ever for people with borderline personality disorder, and they will do almost anything, in order to not be alone. Now, what also goes along with this, to make it even more damaging, is people with borderline personality tend to over-idealize everyone in their life. That everyone in their life is perfect. Everyone in their life is wonderful. Everyone in their life gives them everything they want, except, of course, for the fact that that is not true. That's not true for anybody. There is no one person in your life, odds are, that can give you everything that you need. Unless it's a deity of some kind. They simply cannot. And so, therefore, since everything basically to someone with borderline is either amazingly wonderful or terrible and awful, talk about your all or nothing thinking, they very often get heavily disillusioned and very, very angry at the people who disappoint them. And since we're all disappointed at some point or another by our relationships, it's not really a pleasant time. And in fact, people with borderline personality disorder also have this irresistible impulse to test their relationships. They're so certain that they're going to be rejected, that they're constantly testing their relationship. And any kind of rejection, therefore, will just set them off. Because the person will go from the over-idealization, you're absolutely perfect, to you're absolutely terrible. Remember, there's nothing in between for people with borderline. And it can do that in a heartbeat. It can do that in a snap. And since they're always testing, they're always just being on that emotional roller coaster. And they're always looking for that perfect person who they're not really going to be able to find. I will tell you at this point that this is another disorder that has a kind of a sex ratio skew to it. It tends to skew more female. Again, this is not to say that males cannot suffer from borderline personality disorder. It's just that they're not diagnosed as much. I'm not sure if that's simply because we're not looking for it as much. It's more or less assumed that males don't do this, but that females do. The hysterical female, the clingy female, all that sort of stuff. That may boil over into this even as much as people try to be scientific about it. There can also be a problem with self-mutilation. A lot of times, when these people are in pain, and they're in such serious pain, emotional pain, psychological pain, that sometimes it seems like the only way to get rid of that pain is to impose physical pain. Nowadays, we call them cutters. And very often, people with borderline, because they are so horribly disappointed so often, may resort to this sort of physical pain in order to relieve a little bit of the psychological pain. People with borderline disorder may occasionally also have psychotic episodes in which they're no longer on the borderline and they cross right on over into delusions and hallucinations and that sort of thing, mostly during periods of high stress. Because even in periods where they have no external stress, they are very often putting so much internal stress onto themselves that any external stress can just push them over the line. As with other personality disorders, there's a lot of comorbidity, and again with the usual suspects, plus a new one, substance abuse. There's definitely a comorbidity relationship between borderline personality disorder and misuse of substances, whether legal or illegal. Again, it's difficult to tell whether it's a cause or an effect, whether it's something that is causing the person to behave like this, or whether it's simply their way of trying to treat themselves, of trying to make themselves feel better. Kind of hard to know. When we're looking at causal factors here, we actually have a somewhat better idea for causal factors for this than we do for some of the others. Borderline personality has been studied quite a bit over the past, 10, 15 years, which is probably why we're also hearing about it all the time, because doctors are studying it and people are being diagnosed with it and treatments are being done. It does appear to be very, very genetic. Very genetic. In that a person inherits a vulnerability to certain traits, and these traits are the diathesis to this particular disorder. These traits are the vulnerability. Now, what might be going on here is something to do with serotonin. We talked about serotonin when we were talking about the mood disorders, and serotonin is definitely linked with happiness, it's linked to anxiety, it's linked to depression, it's linked to lots of things, and it may indeed be linked to this, in that possibly not having enough serotonin causes these people to feel like they constantly need attention, like they constantly need reassurance, that they constantly need someone around them. Whatever it is, it's almost certainly polygenic, like everything else is. As I've mentioned a couple of times, there's almost no disorder that is monogenic, that is caused by one gene. So if this is something that's genetic, it's almost certainly polygenic. And that in a lot of ways, it simply depends on the particular arrangement of genes that you inherited. This being said, that it may be genetic, it also appears to be environmental. A lot of people with borderline personality disorder have a history of horrible things happening during their childhood. 90% report some sort of childhood abuse or neglect or maltreatment. It might be a correlation, but that is one hell of a correlation. So almost certainly, if there is a diathesis stress model, that this early childhood stress is almost certainly the stressor that causes this disorder to more or less, appear, that causes it to occur. But I also want to point out that if we're talking about childhood abuse or neglect, virtually all personality disorders have that as a possible causal factor. Maybe not to this extreme. 90% is a big number. But certainly it is not unusual for people who come down with personality disorders to report childhood abuse, neglect, adversity, maltreatment. The last personality disorder that I'm going to talk about is dependent personality disorder, which is more or less, again, exactly what it sounds like. I love it when things are named exactly what they are. Someone with a dependent personality disorder has an extreme need to be taken care of. They are dependent. They are dependent to the max. They see themselves as being completely useless. They can't do anything for themselves. They are inept. Even if they try, they would fail. They're helpless. They're hopeless. They have no self-confidence. They have no self-efficacy. They have no belief that they can do anything at all for themselves. They constantly think that if someone doesn't take care of them, then they are doomed. Now, Again, this is in adults, by the way, because if you have a 5-year-olds think they can take care of themselves just fine. Thank you very much. But, these are in adults. These are adults that in all ways should be able to take care of themselves. Remember, if you are actually helpless and you feel helpless, that's not a disorder. Now, how do these people do? They react with submission to the people who are taking care of them. They don't want to rock the boat. They're always trying to appease them, to make them feel better, to thank them, to make sure they're not going to be any trouble, and so forth and so on, presumably in the hope that the person will then continue taking care of them. These people are terrified they're going to drive off their caregivers, and that therefore no one will take care of them, and therefore they will be doomed. As before, we see comorbidity with other disorders. Very often this is comorbid. And again, in some cases it might make sense. If you have another disorder and you feel like you're broken and you can't take care of yourself, then this indeed may make sense, except it's taken to an extreme. So again, usual suspects: mood disorders, anxiety disorders, other personality disorders, specifically avoidant, which is kind of interesting because you would think avoidant would not necessarily want, but they avoidant people want to have others take care of them. It's just they don't always think that other people will be around to do it, and they feel they're inept and everything. So that goes along with schizoid, borderline, histrionic. Not unusual to see dependent personality disorder along with these. Possible causal factors. Again, this is a correlation, but if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. That there is some kind of genetic predisposition to dependency or anxiety. Could have to do with serotonin, like a lot of the rest of these do. Plus, parents that not only do everything for the child, but also make the child think that they can't do anything right. In the case of authoritarian parents are the my way or the highway form. You do it exactly how I say, exactly when I say it, and stop when I tell you to, which often winds up with children who are afraid to do anything on their own for fear of provoking their parents' wrath, which could also get into dependent personality disorders. You need to tell me what to do so I know that it's okay for me to do it. Because whenever I try to do things by myself, my parents told me I was wrong, I was bad, I was stupid. Or overprotective parents. Overprotective parents can be just as bad. Parents who try to prevent their child from having any kind of adversity, any kind of setback, any kind of thing that they're going to have to sort of, pick themselves up, brush themselves off, and start all over again. These parents are sometimes called snowplow parents, where they go ahead of their child and they remove every single obstacle. So the child has never had to figure out things on their own, to overcome an obstacle on their own, to come up with their own answer, to solve things for themselves. And what this winds up with are kids that think that they can't do anything on their own because they've never had to and they've never had practice. And speaking as an old fogey, I wonder sometimes whether or not we are setting young people up for that by the way that we treat them very often these days. When I was growing up back in the Cenozoic and I would want to go out, and play with my pet dinosaur, I would be out and about on my own, on my bike with other kids with no phone. My parents had no idea where I was because half the time I didn't tell them. If I got a flat tire, if I got lost, I had to figure out how to get home. I had to figure out how to fix it, and I did. And I wound up safe, and I didn't get kidnapped or killed, obviously. And nowadays, of course, people don't need to figure out stuff like that because they can look it up on the phone or they can call somebody and that person will come and rescue them. And I do sometimes wonder about that because I run into a lot of students that the first time they run into problems, they throw their hands up and be like, oh, I can't do it. I can't fix it. Please, you have to help me. They don't even try. And I find that a little stunning because at least you could try. Because quite frankly, if you try and you figure it out on your own, you're going to remember it a lot better than if I tell you. Okay, end of old geezer rant, and also end of this particular video.